A Thursday morning. Fog rolling in from the coast like the sea is trying to swallow the land. A village so small it doesn't appear on any map worth reading. No signal towers, no paved shoulders, no reason for anyone to come here unless they were running from something or had already stopped running altogether. And yet, at exactly 5:47 a.m., the most dangerous man on the eastern seaboard stood at the end of a garden path that smelled of salt and wild thyme, his coat hanging heavy with moisture, his eyes fixed on a door he had spent 4 years, 1 month, and 9 days trying to find. He hadn't knocked. He hadn't moved. He barely breathed. From inside, sounds drifted through the thin walls of the cottage like small, careless confessions. A cabinet closing, water running, the soft percussion of bare feet on old tile. And then, something else. A laugh. Not a woman's laugh. Smaller. Higher. Bright in a way that didn't know the world could be cruel. The sound entered his chest like a blade turned sideways. The door opened without warning, and every war he had ever won became meaningless. She stood in the frame, backlit by a kitchen that glowed amber from a single overhead bulb. No shoes, a faded cotton shirt rolled to the elbows, flour on her hands, on her jaw, on the edge of her collarbone where she had wiped without thinking. Her hair was shorter than he remembered, pulled away from her face with a plain elastic, and she looked thinner, older, rebuilt in a way that had nothing to do with fragility, and everything to do with the kind of strength that forms only when there is no one else to lean on. On her hip, a child, a girl, small, maybe 3. Her arms looped loosely around her mother's neck, still half caught in sleep. She wore a knitted sweater too large for her, the sleeves folded twice, and her legs dangled bare beneath a pair of striped shorts that had seen better seasons. His mind did what minds do when they encounter the impossible. It rejected it, rearranged it, tried to make the image fit into a version of reality where this did not mean what every cell in his body already knew it meant. Then the girl lifted her head. Gray eyes. Pale, sharp, unmistakable. The exact shade that had stared back at him from every mirror he had ever stood in front of. Not close, not similar. His. His lungs stopped working. The girl blinked, studying him with a calm curiosity that should not have existed in someone so young. She tilted her head, her small fingers tightening on the collar of her mother's shirt, not in fear, but in focus, like she was trying to understand something that hadn't been explained to her yet. Daria. Her name came out of him like something torn loose from deep tissue, not spoken, extracted. She didn't flinch. She didn't soften. Her eyes met his, and held there with a steadiness that felt practiced, rehearsed, lived in. No surprise, no confusion. Only recognition followed immediately by a wall so solid it might as well have been made of iron. "You need to leave," she said. Not loud, not sharp, just final. "Daria, please. There's nothing here for you." The girl shifted on her hip, those gray eyes narrowing just slightly like a lock clicking into place. "Mama," she whispered, her voice soft and unbothered. "Why is there a man in our garden?" Something inside him fractured along a line he didn't know existed. Daria's arm tightened around the child, pulling her closer in a gesture so instinctive it bypassed thought entirely. "He's leaving," she said calmly. "But he's not moving," the girl observed, as if correcting a small factual error. The door closed, not slammed, worse, pulled shut with a control that said more than violence ever could. The latch caught with a small metallic click, and the sound traveled through him like a crack through glass, the kind that doesn't shatter anything right away, but makes it impossible for the structure to hold. He stood there. The fog thickened. His hands hung at his sides, and for the first time in his adult life, they were useless. Those hands had ended alliances, reshaped territories, held weapons and contracts and the fates of men who thought they were untouchable. Now they hung empty in a garden that belonged to a woman who wanted him gone and a child who didn't know his name. He didn't leave. Instead, he lowered himself onto the damp wooden bench beside the garden path, the one with peeling green paint and one leg shorter than the others. He sat there with his elbows on his knees and the fog settling over him like the world was trying to make him disappear. And he let it. Inside, the girl's voice carried faintly through the walls. "Mama." He sat down. Silence. "Mama, I think he's waiting for something." Then Daria's voice, quieter than before, stripped of everything except the thing she couldn't hide. "He's waiting for something that doesn't exist anymore." And outside, in a garden that smelled like the end of the world, the most powerful man in 4 cities pressed his palms together and stayed. The night that started everything did not begin with him. It began with a dress. It was blue. Not the kind of blue that demands attention. Not royal. Not electric. Not the blue of women who walk into rooms expecting to be seen. It was quieter than that. Soft, simple, falling just past the knee with a neckline that sat flat against the collarbone. No beading, no designer tag, and no story behind it except the truth. It cost $43 from a second-hand shop on Alcott Street, and I had tried it on 4 times in the mirror before convincing myself it was enough. It was supposed to be enough. The gala was not my world. I knew that the moment I stepped through the glass doors of the Regency Alcove Hotel and felt the air change, the temperature, the sound, the way people moved through the lobby like they had been born knowing how to occupy space without apology. Crystal chandeliers hung low enough to make the light feel personal. The floors reflected everything like the building itself was watching. And somewhere in the crowd, a string quartet played something I almost recognized but couldn't quite name. I was there because of the flowers. That was my work. I arranged flowers at a small shop on the east side of the city where the rent was still survivable, and the clients were mostly weddings and funerals and the occasional apology delivered in roses. But that month, a contract had come through for the Regency Alcove's annual charity auction. I had spent 2 full days building arrangements that no one would remember by morning, and when the event coordinator offered me an invitation to stay for the evening, I should have said no. I said yes. I told myself it was curiosity. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was something smaller and more dangerous. The quiet belief that I could exist in a space like this without being measured, without being found lacking. That belief lasted exactly 40 minutes. I had positioned myself near the edge of the room, close enough to the bar to hold a glass of something I didn't drink, far enough from the center to avoid conversation. When you grow up on the outside of rooms like this, you learn to read them before they read you. And then I heard his voice. Vaughn. It hit me before I turned, before I saw him, before anything visual confirmed what my body already knew. That voice, polished and precise, shaped by boarding schools and inheritance and the absolute certainty that every room he entered had been waiting for him. He stood 15 feet away, surrounded by people who gravitated toward money not because they needed it, but because proximity to it made them feel real. He wore a charcoal suit that fit like it had been stitched onto his body, a glass of something amber in his hand. Beside him, a woman, tall. Dark hair pinned in a way that looked effortless but wasn't. A dress designed to make other women feel invisible. 6 months. That was how long it had been since he told me, calmly, that I was not the kind of woman who fit into the life he was building. That I was lovely? Yes. Warm? Yes. But warmth wasn't architecture, and he needed someone who could stand beside him without making the frame look uneven. I should have left the moment I saw him, but my feet didn't move, and that hesitation cost me everything. He saw me. The flicker of recognition crossed his face, followed by something worse. Amusement. He said something to the woman beside him. She glanced over, smiled. The kind of smile that isn't a smile at all, but a verdict. Then he walked toward me, and the crowd between us parted without knowing why. Daria. His voice carried just enough warmth to sound civilized. I didn't expect to see you here. I did the arrangements, I said, and immediately hated myself for explaining. His eyes dropped, slowly, deliberately. Down to the dress, the blue dress, the $43 dress I had convinced myself was enough. He didn't say anything right away. The look was the sentence, and everyone nearby was the jury. You look... He paused, tilting his head like he was searching for the right word. Brave. The word landed exactly where he intended it. Not as a compliment. As a diagnosis. Brave. As in, it takes courage to wear that here. As in, you must know how this looks. As in, you still don't understand the room you're standing in. Someone behind him laughed. Not at the word itself, but at the silence that followed it. My fingers tightened around the glass in my hand. My smile held, because that was what I had learned to do. Hold the shape of something even after the inside had collapsed. Thank you, I said. My voice didn't shake. I made sure of that. He nodded, already turning away, the interaction filed and forgotten before he had even completed the motion. I was a footnote. I stood there, my body refusing to leave, the room still watching. And across the floor, in the deeper shadow near the east wall where the chandeliers didn't quite reach, someone else had been watching too. Not the room, not the crowd, not the spectacle. Just me. I didn't see him approach. One moment the space beside me was empty. The next, it wasn't. He didn't announce himself the way men in that room did. He simply arrived, the way weather changes, without permission and without apology. The peonies near the south window, he said, his voice low enough that I had to turn toward him to hear it clearly. You cut the stems at an angle. Most people don't bother. I looked at him, and the first thing I registered was stillness. Not the kind that comes from calm. The kind that comes from absolute certainty about where you stand in a room, in a city, in the world. He was tall, dark-haired, wearing a suit that was expensive in a way that had nothing to prove. His face was not handsome the way magazines define it. It was compelling in the way certain landscapes are, structured by something harder than beauty, something closer to geography. His eyes were gray, pale, almost silver in the low light, and they were looking at me like I was the only thing in the room worth focusing on. You notice the stems? I said, because I didn't know what else to say. I notice everything. There was no arrogance in it. Just fact. He turned slightly, his gaze landing briefly on the cluster where Vaughn stood, where the laughter had come from. His expression didn't change, but something behind it did. A small realignment, like a scope adjusting. The man who spoke to you, he said, does he always perform cruelty like it's a party trick? Or is tonight special? The question cut through every defense I had built in the last 5 minutes. I opened my mouth to deflect, to minimize, to make the wound smaller than it was. He didn't say anything cruel. I heard myself respond. He looked at me then, directly, and the steadiness of his gaze made the lie impossible to sustain. Yes, he did, he said, and every person within 15 feet heard it. The difference is, most of them agreed with him. I didn't. Severin, he said, as if offering me something rather than introducing himself. Daria? He nodded once, the kind of nod that says I already know, but I wanted to hear you say it. Then he turned his body fully toward the room, toward Vaughn, still holding his amber glass, still radiating the confidence of a man who has never been made to feel small. Severin didn't raise his voice. He didn't move toward him. He simply looked at him. It lasted 3 seconds. Maybe 4. But in that window, Vaughn's attention snagged. His eyes found Severin, and the recognition that crossed his face was not social. It was chemical. The animal brain identifying a predator before the conscious mind has finished processing the shape. Vaughn's smile didn't drop. It froze. Which was worse, because a dropped smile can be picked back up. A frozen one has nowhere to go. Severin held the gaze with the patience of a man who had all the time in the world and then turned back to me. "The arrangements really are exceptional," he said, as if nothing had happened. "The asymmetry in the centerpieces. Most designers would have mirrored them. You didn't." "Symmetry is predictable," I said. My voice was steadier than it should have been. Something about his presence had rearranged the air around me, made it feel like the room had shifted its center of gravity. "It is," he agreed. Then, quieter. "So is the opinion of a man who measures people by what they wear instead of what they build." The words landed somewhere deep, in a place that had been clenched tight for 6 months, waiting for someone to say something that didn't require me to be smaller than I was. He reached into his jacket, removed a card, and placed it on the bar beside my untouched glass. Thick paper, black ink, a name and a number. Nothing else. "If you ever want to arrange flowers for someone who understands what they're looking at," he said, "that's where to find me." Then he walked back into the part of the room where the shadows were deeper and the light didn't ask questions. I watched him go, and for reasons I could not explain, I didn't feel rescued. I felt seen. And at that moment, being seen was more dangerous than anything else. Across the room, Vaughn had not moved. But the ease was gone, replaced by something tighter, something watchful, like a man who had just realized the room he thought he owned had a door he had never noticed before. And behind that door, something had already begun. I called the number 11 days later. Not because I wanted to, because a pipe burst in the shop on Alcott Street, flooded the walk-in cooler, and destroyed $4,000 worth of inventory I couldn't afford to replace. Insurance wouldn't cover it. The landlord wouldn't fix it. And the only freelance contract large enough to keep me solvent was the kind that required a client who didn't negotiate down. Severin answered on the second ring. He didn't sound surprised. He simply listened, asked one question, "When can you start?" and gave me an address. The estate sat on a hillside 40 minutes outside the city, behind walls that looked decorative but weren't. I arrived expecting a house. What I found was a territory. Grounds that stretched in every direction, staff that moved with military discipline, and a silence that hung in the hallways like it was guarding something. I arranged flowers, that was all. Twice a week, then 3 times, then every day, because the arrangements changed with the rooms, with the season, with something I couldn't name, but could feel shifting beneath the surface of that place. He never told me what he did. I never asked. But the answer was everywhere. In the men who arrived at odd hours with tension carved into their faces, in the phone calls behind closed doors, in the way certain rooms went quiet at certain times, like the house itself was holding its breath. I should have been afraid. But rationality had never been the thing that moved me. Curiosity had. And Severin, for all the silence and control that surrounded him, was the most curious person I had ever met. He noticed things, not the way Vaughn had, cataloging surfaces and calculating worth. Severin noticed meaning, the way I grouped stems by texture instead of color, the way I placed arrangements off-center to draw the eye towards something it might otherwise have missed. The way I always left one element slightly wild because perfection without imperfection is forgettable. "You build tension into everything," he said one evening, standing in the doorway, his jacket removed, his sleeves rolled to the forearm. "Even the flowers argue with each other." I looked up. my hands still damp from cutting chrysanthemums. Flowers don't argue. Yours do. He stepped into the room, studying the arrangement on the far table the way someone studies a problem they find beautiful. The tall ones are reaching for something the short ones have already given up on. That's not design. That's narrative. I laughed. Not the polite, controlled laugh I had learned to offer in rooms where I didn't belong. A real one. Brief. Caught off guard. Pulled from somewhere I thought I had sealed shut. It surprised me more than it surprised him. And what I noticed about Severin was that he was two men. The one who stood in front of me now. Quiet. Attentive. Capable of seeing beauty in the angle of a cut stem. And the one who existed in the rooms I was never invited into, where voices lowered and outcomes were decided in ways that didn't leave marks on paper. I fell in love with the first one. I told myself the second one didn't touch me. Weeks passed, dinners that lasted past midnight, mornings where I arrived early and found him already awake, reading at a desk littered with papers he covered when I entered, the habit of a man who had never had anyone to trust with the full shape of his life. The first time he kissed me, it was in the greenhouse behind the east wing, surrounded by gardenias that smelled like the edge of sleep. His hand had settled on the side of my neck, steady, warm, precise. And I thought, this is what it feels like to be held by someone who knows exactly how much pressure to apply and chooses gentleness anyway. I moved into the estate by the end of the second month. Not because he asked, but because leaving had become harder than staying. I met his people. Most treated me with a distant respect borrowed from his authority, but one of them was different. Rennick. He had been with Severin longer than anyone. Chief strategist, advisor, the mind behind decisions that never carried his fingerprints. He was polite in a way that felt constructed. Every word placed. Every silence measured. When he looked at me, he smiled, but the smile never reached past the surface of his face. It sat there like a door that had been painted shut. "She's good for you," he told Severin once, in a room where I was meant to be out of earshot but wasn't. His voice was even, approving, grounding. Severin said nothing. "Just make sure the grounding doesn't become an anchor," Rennick added, quieter. "Anchors can be cut." The words drifted past me at the time. I didn't hold on to them. I didn't replay them. I didn't let them settle into the place where instinct lives. That was my second mistake. The first was believing I could exist in his world without being consumed by it. The second was trusting that the walls were there to protect me, when at least one of them had already started closing in. The file was not hidden. That was what destroyed me most. Not what it contained, but where I found it. Not in a locked drawer or a vault, or buried inside encrypted systems built for secrets. It sat inside the second cabinet of his study, in a plain brown folder, between a property deed and a tax filing. Ordinary, administrative, like it didn't matter enough to protect, like I didn't matter enough to protect it from. I wasn't looking for it. I was looking for an insurance document, something about the greenhouse renovation. The folder caught my attention only because my name was on the tab, handwritten, small block letters, Daria Kovac. I opened it, standing up, my body still angled toward the cabinet, the overhead light casting a shadow across the first page. What I saw didn't register immediately. The mind doesn't work that way, not when it's encountering something that contradicts everything it has built itself around. It delays. It buffers. It gives you 3, maybe 4 seconds of ignorance before everything collapses. Photographs. Of me. Not recent. Not candid moments from our life together. These were older, time-stamped. The earliest dated 5 weeks before the gala at the Regency alcove. Me leaving my shop on Alcott Street. Me carrying arrangements into a delivery van. Me sitting alone at a cafe, wearing the expression of someone who has been carefully hollowed out and is learning to walk upright regardless. Someone had been watching me before I ever knew Severin existed. My hands didn't tremble. That came later. In the moment, my body did what it had learned to do under Vaughn. It went still. Completely. Dangerously still. I turned the page. A printed dossier. My full name. My address. My work contracts. My financial records. Beneath that, a single paragraph typed in a font too clean to feel human. Subject maintains no protective ties, no family network, no financial safety net. Emotional isolation confirmed following dissolution of prior relationship. V. Kessler. Vulnerability index high. Approach window. Optimal within 30 to 45 days. Vulnerability index. The words sat on the page like a surgical instrument left inside a patient. I read them again, then again, each time feeling a different layer of meaning settle into my chest like sediment at the bottom of something I thought was clear water. Beneath the dossier, handwritten notes, meeting points, dates, observations. One entry caught in my throat and stayed there. Gala placement confirmed. VK attendance verified through Regency Catering Manifest. Subject expected to attend based on floral contract. Interception point, post-confrontation, East Bar. Interception point, the gala, the flowers, the blue dress. Vaughn's voice saying brave like it was a scalpel. And then Severin, arriving like weather, like accident, like something that could never have been planned, except it had been. All of it. Every angle calculated, every moment engineered, every vulnerability mapped and exploited by a man who had studied me the way he studied territories, identifying weak points, optimal entry, the precise amount of pressure required to make something open without breaking. Or so the file said. I don't know how long I stood there. Every memory I had of us shifted under the weight of what I was reading, replaying behind my eyes with a colder soundtrack, one where every gentle word became strategy and every tender moment became extraction. The greenhouse, the gardenias, his hand on my neck, steady, warm, precise, precise. That word had once made me feel held. Now it made me feel handled. I closed the folder. I placed it back in the cabinet. I pushed the drawer shut with the heel of my palm, and the sound it made was small and absolute. I didn't cry. I didn't confront. I didn't call his name or wait for his footsteps or give him the chance to explain it away with that voice, the one that made me believe in things that were never real. The woman who walked out of that study was not the woman who had walked in. That woman had trusted the architecture of his world. This one understood that the walls had never been protecting her. They had been containing her. And somewhere inside that realization, something that had survived Vaughn, survived loneliness, survived the $43 dress and the word brave, and every small indignity that had ever tried to reduce her, that something finally stopped fighting, not because it was defeated, because it had decided to leave. I did not pack. Packing would have meant deciding what mattered, and I no longer trusted myself to know. Everything inside that estate had been chosen by a version of me that no longer existed, a version who believed she had been seen when she had only been studied. I took my coat, my phone, which I would discard within the hour, the cash I kept in the lining of my work bag, a habit I had carried from a childhood where certainty was something other people had, and my mother's ring, a thin silver band with no stone, no worth to anyone except me. The estate was quiet at that hour. Late afternoon, the light slanting golden through the west-facing windows. Staff moved through the lower halls with practiced invisibility. I moved with them, matching their pace, their posture, their downward gaze. When you have spent enough time being overlooked, you learn that invisibility is not a weakness. It is a skill, and skills are portable. I passed the greenhouse, The gardenias were blooming. The scent reached me through the corridor, sweet and heavy, and tied to a memory that I could no longer afford to hold. I did not stop. The side entrance near the kitchen loading bay opened onto a gravel path that curved behind the estate and joined the service road a quarter-mile downhill. No cameras on this stretch. I knew because I had watched the security team rotate their monitors during the months I lived here, not out of suspicion, but out of the same instinct that made me notice the angle of a stem or the tension in a room. I watched things. I always had. And now that habit was the only thing keeping me moving. I reached the road. A bus stop 3 miles east connected to a regional line that ran south along the coast. I had memorized the schedule during a week when Severin had been away, and the estate had felt too large, too quiet, too much like a place that was watching me instead of housing me. I changed buses twice, paid in cash, spoke to no one. At a station in a town whose name I never learned, I dropped my phone into a trash bin and felt the last digital thread connecting me to his world dissolve without ceremony. By nightfall, I had reached the coast. The road narrowed, the trees thickened, and the air shifted from industrial to salt. I could hear the sea before I could see it, a low, constant rhythm that didn't care about anything, didn't judge, didn't measure, didn't calculate vulnerability indexes or map interception points. It just moved endlessly, without agenda. Fellsworth appeared like something the coastline had forgotten to dismantle. A single road, a stone quay, houses built tight against each other like they were bracing for weather, a pub with no sign, a post office with hand-painted hours, a nursery at the far end of the village with glass walls fogged from humidity and light glowing green through the condensation like something alive was breathing inside. The man who ran the nursery was older than the building. His hands were cracked and dark with earth. His back curved from decades of bending toward things that grew slowly. He looked up when I entered, studied me once with eyes that had stopped being interested in explanations long ago, and said nothing. "Do you need help here?" I asked. He looked at me, then at the rows of seedlings behind him, then back at me. 5 in the morning, he said. "Don't be late." No name exchanged, no history requested. He simply offered what he had, and I took it because taking was the only thing I had left. Days passed. I worked with my hands in the soil. I learned the names of plants I had never grown, the slower ones, the ones that didn't bloom on demand but waited for conditions to be right before offering anything. The village didn't ask who I was. They saw a woman who worked early, spoke little, and kept her grief folded so tightly it was invisible to anyone who wasn't looking for it. That was enough. In a place like Fellsworth, enough was everything. 3 weeks after I arrived, the nausea started. Not the kind that comes from exhaustion or grief. This was deeper, more rhythmic, arriving each morning like a clock that had been set without my knowledge. The clinic was a 15-minute walk along the coastal path. The doctor was a woman with short gray hair and glasses on a chain around her neck. She asked the questions I expected. She handed me a result I was not prepared for. Pregnant. I walked back along the cliff path, the wind pulling at my coat, the sea crashing below. My hand drifted to my stomach without instruction, and the gesture was so instinctive, so immediate, that it frightened me more than the word itself. Because this meant I was no longer just carrying the grief of what he had done. I was carrying the proof that it had been real enough to leave something behind, something alive, something that would grow regardless of whether the man who had planted it had ever truly seen me or only studied the contours of my loneliness until he found the door. And if he ever found out, he wouldn't come for me. He would come for what was his. The months that followed moved the way tides do, steady, rhythmic, indifferent to whether you are ready for them. I worked at the nursery until my hands knew the soil better than they had ever known silk or crystal, or the cold marble surfaces of an estate built to impress people who confused wealth with substance. My body changed slowly at first, then all at once, the way important things do. The village noticed before I was ready for them to. Not with questions, not with judgment, but with gestures so small they barely registered as kindness. An extra loaf left on the post office steps, a woolen blanket folded over the railing of my stairway with no note attached. A jar of honey from the woman who ran the pub, placed on my windowsill while I slept, as though the act of caring was something best done in secret so the recipient wouldn't feel the weight of obligation. I didn't let myself think about him. That was the rule, the only one that mattered. Because if I allowed those memories to exist alongside what I had found, the contradiction would have torn me apart. And I could no longer afford to be torn. There was someone else now. Someone who needed me to hold together. The pregnancy was uncomplicated, which felt like the universe's single concession to a woman it had otherwise decided to test without mercy. I slept poorly. I ate because I had to. I grew larger in a body that had once been a place of grief and was now becoming a place of origin. She arrived on a night when the sea was louder than I had ever heard it. Not a storm exactly, but something close. The kind of weather that sits on the edge of destruction and decides at the last moment to pull back. The wind battered the windows of the clinic. The power flickered twice. And somewhere between one contraction and the next, I stopped being afraid of the future and became entirely consumed by the present. She came fast. Faster than the doctor expected. Faster than my body was prepared for. Like she had already decided that waiting was not something she intended to do with her life. The cry was sharp, immediate, a sound that filled the room and pushed everything else to the margins. They placed her on my chest, and the weight of her was so small and so absolute that it rearranged every priority I had ever held. I looked at her face, still red, still furious, still adjusting to the shock of being outside, and I searched it for the thing I was most afraid to find. It was there. Her eyes, when they opened minutes later, were gray. Not dark gray, not blue-gray, not any diluted version that might have been attributed to chance. They were pale, sharp, and unmistakable. Silver in certain light. The exact shade I had seen every morning across a breakfast table in an estate that no longer existed in my life, but had left its signature in the one thing I could never walk away from. His eyes. In her face. Looking up at me with a clarity that had no right to exist in someone minutes old. I held her tighter, and something inside my chest cracked open. Not the way things break when they are destroyed, but the way earth cracks when something beneath it is finally pushing through. I named her Vesna. It means spring. Not because the season was kind, or because I believed in new beginnings with blind optimism. I named her that because spring comes after everything has been stripped away, after the cold has done its worst and the ground has been frozen so long it forgets what it's capable of. Spring doesn't arrive because the world is ready. It arrives because it refuses to wait. Vesna, my daughter. My answer to every question I didn't know how to ask. I held her through the rest of that night, listening to the sea settle and her breathing steady, and I understood with a certainty that felt like iron in my bones that this child was both my greatest protection and my greatest risk. Because those eyes, that gray, that impossible, unmistakable silver, they were a signature. And signatures can be traced. If anyone from his world ever saw her, even for a moment, they would know exactly whose daughter she was. And then, the search would begin. He did not notice she was gone for 7 hours. That detail would haunt him longer than anything else because it meant that for 7 hours, his world had continued functioning as though she were still in it. Meetings had been taken, calls had been made, decisions had been reached, while the one thing that gave it meaning was walking away through corridors he had never thought to watch. The discovery came not with alarm, but with silence. Her coat, absent from the hook near the east corridor. Her work bag, gone from the greenhouse bench. The arrangement she had been building that morning, half finished, abandoned mid-stem. The scissors still open beside it like a mouth caught in the middle of a sentence that would never be completed. Severin stood in the greenhouse for a long time, staring at those scissors, and understanding with a cold and immediate clarity that this was not a temporary absence. People who intend to come back close their scissors. The search was surgical. Every exit reviewed. Every camera frame analyzed. She had walked out through the service corridor near the kitchen loading bay, moving with the staff, matching their rhythm, their posture, their habitual invisibility. She had passed 3 checkpoints and been invisible in all of them, not because the cameras failed, but because she had understood the system well enough to exist inside its blind spots. His men found nothing. No phone signal, no card transaction, no digital footprint. She had disappeared with the same totality that characterized everything she did, thoroughly, precisely, without leaving a single thread to pull. Weeks dissolved into months. He stopped sleeping in the bed they had shared. He stopped entering the greenhouse entirely. The gardenias bloomed and died and bloomed again without anyone cutting them, and their scent drifted through the halls like the ghost of a conversation that had ended mid-sentence. It was during the 4th month that he found the folder. He had been looking for something else when his hand found the brown folder with her name on the tab. The photographs, the dossier, the typed paragraph with its clinical language. None of it belonged to him. None of it had been created or authorized by him. Someone had built a case file on the woman he loved and placed it where she would find it. Not hidden, not locked. Placed. The file was not intelligence. It was a weapon, designed to detonate on contact, to make every real moment look engineered and every genuine feeling look calculated. It took 5 weeks to trace. 5 weeks of dismantling the internal workings of his own organization, following money rerouted through dormant accounts, tracing communication channels that existed in margins no one monitored. Rennick. His strategist, his advisor, the man who had stood beside him longer than anyone, who had watched Daria enter his life and called her grounding. The man who had said anchors can be cut. He had not said it as an observation. He had said it as a plan. The connection to Vaughn was the second fracture. Threaded through intermediaries and a resentment that had festered since the night at the Regency alcove when Vaughn felt something shift in the gaze of someone he had assumed would never look at him again. Vaughn had wanted her diminished. Rennick had wanted her removed. Together, they had built a fiction precise enough to collapse a world. The photographs were taken by a contractor Rennick hired independently. The dossier compiled from Rennick's access to Severin's security systems. The typed paragraph crafted to read like operational planning. None of it was real. Every word was fabricated, and Daria had found it exactly when and where she was meant to. Rennick did not disappear quickly. Thoroughness required patience. Every node of the conspiracy was identified, documented, and dismantled with the precision of a man who understood that incomplete justice leaves roots in the ground. Vaughn lasted longer, not because he was smarter, but because his destruction required a different kind of approach, the kind that made a man lose everything he valued: his reputation, his connections, his carefully curated position, without ever understanding who had taken it or why. By the end, both men existed only in the past tense. Gone. The word was simple. The execution was not. But none of it brought her back. The conspiracy was ash. The truth was clear. And somewhere on a coastline he had never heard of, a woman who believed she had been studied instead of loved was raising a child he didn't know existed. The search changed after that. Not wider, deeper. Because this time he was not looking for a woman who had left him. He was looking for a woman who had been driven away by a lie built inside his own walls. And the difference between those two things was the difference between finding someone and deserving to. It was not a photograph. It was not a name or a transaction. It was a flower. One of his people, a woman named Kala, who had been assigned to monitor botanical suppliers along the southern coast, flagged a purchase order from a nursery in a village she had never heard of. The order itself was unremarkable. A modest quantity of Vanda coerulea, a high-altitude orchid notoriously difficult to cultivate outside controlled environments. What caught her attention was the grafting specification attached to the order. A lateral splice technique applied to the root system before potting, a method so specific that it appeared in no manual, no textbook, no published guide. She had seen it once before, in an arrangement that still sat, dried and preserved, on a shelf in the east corridor of the estate. An arrangement built by hands that no longer lived there. Severin did not send anyone. 4 years of loss had taught him that delegation was distance, and distance was what had cost him everything. He drove alone, leaving before dawn, telling no one. The drive took 6 hours. The city fell away behind him. Highways became roads, roads became lanes, and lanes became a single track that hugged the coastline with a stubbornness that felt personal. Fellsworth did not announce itself. It existed the way tide pools exist, formed by conditions rather than intention, surviving because nothing had bothered to displace it. He parked at the edge of the village. He walked past the pub, past the post office, past the quay. Something pulled him toward the cottage set back from the lane, the one with the garden path and the bench with peeling paint. Instinct, perhaps. Or the sense that the center of her life would not be where she worked, but where she lived. He stood at the end of the path. The fog was thick. From inside, the sounds he would later learn by heart. Her morning rhythm, small and steady. And then a child's laugh, bright enough to stop his blood. The door opened. She stood there holding a girl with gray eyes that needed no explanation. Everything he had prepared to say, every word he had rehearsed across 6 hours of empty road, dissolved. His mind rejected the child the way the body rejects shock, a brief refusal before the truth floods in. Then recognition detonated, not building, not growing, just arriving all at once with a certainty that left no room for doubt. His. Daria. Her name came out fractured. She held the child tighter. "There's nothing here for you." The door closed. The lock caught. And the man who had controlled 4 cities stood in a garden at the edge of the sea and did not move. He lowered himself onto the bench. The fog settled over him. And he stayed. Because the alternative was walking away from the only thing that had ever mattered, and he had already done that once without knowing it. He would not do it again. He stayed for 9 days, not inside, not nearby, on the bench, in the garden, through mornings that smelled of salt, and evenings that turned the sky into something bruised and beautiful above the water. The village watched from a distance, sensing something in his stillness that discouraged approach. Not danger exactly, but gravity. She felt him there the way you feel, weather changing. She told herself that patience was just another form of strategy. That a man who had mapped her vulnerabilities was simply recalculating his approach. But the days kept passing, and the strategy never came. Vesna noticed him the way children notice everything, without the filters adults build to protect themselves from inconvenient truths. "The man is still in our garden," she announced on the 4th morning, her face pressed against the window, her breath fogging the glass. "I know." "Is he broken?" The question was so precise it felt surgical. "Why do you ask that?" "Because he sits the way I sit when something hurts and I don't want to tell you." Daria's hand stilled on the countertop. The comparison landed in a place she hadn't defended. Somewhere below the anger, in the raw space where a mother recognizes the emotional intelligence of her child and realizes it has already surpassed her ability to hide from it. On the sixth day, the nursery owner spoke to her for only the second time about anything unrelated to work. "The man on your bench," he said, not looking up from the seedlings he was transplanting. "He hasn't eaten." "That's his choice." "It is." A pause. Doesn't make it less true. That evening, she left a plate on the garden wall. Bread, cheese, a handful of olives. No words, no eye contact. When she checked in the morning, the plate was empty and placed neatly by the door. It happened on the 9th afternoon. Vesna was in the garden, pulling at weeds with the serious concentration she applied to everything. The stone was half buried near the edge of the path. She tripped over it without warning, her body pitching forward, her forehead striking the ground with a sound that was small, and then silent. The kind of silence that is worse than crying because it means the pain hasn't found its voice yet. Then the blood. A cut above the left eyebrow, the kind that looks worse than it is because scalps bleed freely and heads are disproportionately alarming on small bodies. The sight of it, red against the pale skin of her daughter's face, froze something inside Daria that she had not known could still freeze. He reached her first, not because he was closer, but because his body had been coiled in readiness for 9 days, every nerve calibrated to the space between that bench and that child. He knelt beside Vesna with a steadiness that had nothing to do with power and everything to do with presence. His hands moved with a gentleness so precise it looked like something he had been practicing in silence for years. He pressed his palm against the cut, enough pressure to slow the bleeding without frightening her. His other hand cradled the back of her head, supporting it the way you support something irreplaceable. "You're all right," he said, and his voice was low, unhurried, and warm in a way that settled over the child like a blanket pulled up in the dark. "It's just a small cut. It'll stop in a minute." Vesna looked up at him, her gray eyes wet but focused, and she did not pull away. Then she did something that neither of them expected. She reached up and pressed her small hand flat against his cheek. Not in pain, not in need, in recognition. The kind that lives below language, below memory. The kind that simply knows. Daria stood 3 feet away, her chest so tight she could not draw a full breath. The image, his hands on her daughter, his voice soft, Vesna's palm against his face, dismantled something she had spent 4 years building. Not all of it. Not the grief, not the years, not the nights spent alone, but the certainty. The clean, necessary certainty that he had never been real. Because this was real. Later, after the cut was cleaned and Vesna had fallen asleep with her hand curled under her chin, Daria stepped onto the porch. He was on the bench. She sat down beside him. Not close, not far. In the space between punishment and permission. "I found a file," she said, "in your study, with my name on it." "I know. I found it after you left." It had photographs of me from before we met, surveillance, a dossier, language that made me sound like a target. "You were never a target." The file said otherwise. "The file was built by a man named Rennick, who wanted you gone because you were the one thing he couldn't control through me." He paused. "He worked with Vaughn. Your ex provided the motive. Rennick provided the access. Together, they constructed something designed to reframe everything real as something manufactured." She was quiet for a long time. "The gala," she said. "The night we met. You noticing the stems." "Real," he said. "All of it." "The greenhouse." "Real." "You telling me my flowers argue with each other." His voice dropped to something barely above the sound of the sea. "Every word." The silence that followed was not empty. It was dense with years lost and truths rearranged, heavy with the understanding that the villain of her story had never been the man sitting beside her. 4 years, she said. I raised her alone for 4 years, believing I was nothing to you but a calculation. I know. I don't know what to do with this, she admitted, and her voice cracked for the first time since he arrived. He didn't reach for her. He didn't close the distance. He sat with his hands on his knees, offering the one thing no one had ever given her consistently: space to feel without being managed. You don't have to know, he said. Not tonight. Not tomorrow. I'm not asking you to trust me. I'm asking you to let me earn it. However long that takes. The sea moved below the cliffs. The fog thinned. And for the first time in 4 years, the cottage did not feel like a hiding place. It felt like a home that was deciding what it wanted to become. She didn't take his hand. She didn't lean into him. She didn't offer forgiveness or promise a future. She stayed. That was all. She stayed on the bench beside him while the night settled over Fellsworth and the sea kept its rhythm, and somewhere inside the cottage, a girl with silver-gray eyes slept with her hand curled under her chin, dreaming of things that had not happened yet. And in the morning, when Vesna pressed her face to the window and saw two people sitting where there had only ever been one, she smiled. Not because she understood what had changed, but because something in her, something quiet and deep and older than memory, recognized that the shape of things had finally become what it was always supposed to be. And outside, on a bench with peeling paint in a village the world had forgotten, a man who had once controlled 4 cities finally understood that power had never been the thing worth holding on to. It was this. It had always been this.